What if you woke up tomorrow and everything was gone? No heat, no blankets, no hot food, no way to call for help. Just you, the freezing cold, and the very real chance you wouldn't make it to spring. Sit with that feeling for a second. Now here's the part that'll mess with your head. That wasn't a nightmare for our ancient ancestors. That was just Tuesday for 10,000 years. They had no thermostat, no insulated walls, no grocery store, and yet, somehow, they didn't just survive. They thrived across some of the harshest conditions this planet has ever thrown at a living creature. We're talking about anatomically modern Homo sapiens going back 300,000 years, and even before us. The Neanderthals were already out there grinding through full Ice Age winters. At the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, global temperatures were 6 degrees Celsius colder than today. That's enough to bury London under a solid kilometer of ice. So how exactly did they pull it off? What you're about to find out will completely change the way you see human survival, and some of it is genuinely shocking. If that's got you hooked, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me how long you think you'd last in an Ice Age winter, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Okay, fire. Yeah, we all know ancient humans used fire. That feels almost too obvious to even mention, right? But here's the thing, most people think about fire and picture someone just staying warm next to a flame, and that mental image is selling the whole story incredibly short. Fire wasn't a comfort tool. It was the most sophisticated survival technology these people had, and it was doing at least a dozen critical jobs at the exact same time. Think about this. Cooking food over fire doesn't just make it taste better. It makes calories dramatically more available to the body. Evolutionary biologist Richard Wrangham has argued compellingly that cooking is literally what allowed the human brain to grow as large as it did over hundreds of thousands of years. We traded gut tissue for brain tissue because fire was doing the digestive work our bodies no longer needed to do. Fire didn't just keep our ancestors warm, fire made them smarter. Let that sink in. And it didn't stop there. A roaring fire kept cave lions away, animals that weighed up to 300 kilograms and had absolutely no reason to be afraid of a human being. It hardened wooden spear tips into more effective weapons. It provided light during winters where darkness stretched across 16 hours of every single day. It dried wet clothing, which in freezing temperatures is the difference between staying alive and dying of hypothermia within hours. It heated enclosed shelters to temperatures a human body could actually function in. But here's the detail that most people have never heard, and it changes everything. There were firekeepers, people whose entire role within the group was to make sure the flame never went out. Losing the fire during a blizzard with no way to restart it was potentially a death sentence for everyone. That means the most important person in an Ice Age survival group might not have been the strongest hunter or the fiercest fighter. It was the one quietly tending the flame while everyone else slept. So we've talked about fire, but where exactly were these people when that fire was burning? If you're picturing a lone human huddled in a random cave, I need you to update that image immediately. Yes, caves were used. But when archaeologists actually studied those caves, what they found inside completely changed the way we understand prehistoric survival. These weren't just holes in a rock. They were organized living spaces, stone-lined fire pits, positioned specifically for maximum heat distribution, clearly designated sleeping areas, separate zones for tool-making and food preparation. This was intentional. This was prehistoric interior design. But here's where it gets truly mind-blowing. Caves weren't always available where people needed to be. Resources moved, animals migrated, and Ice Age humans followed. So when there was no cave, they didn't sit in the snow and hope for the best. They built their own shelters. And what they built will genuinely stop you in your tracks. In parts of Eastern Europe and Siberia, modern-day Ukraine, the Czech Republic, the Russian plains, archaeologists have uncovered circular structures constructed almost entirely from mammoth bones. Femurs, shoulder blades, jaw bones, vertebrae, carefully interlocked and stacked to form walls, then covered with stretched animal hides to block the wind. The most famous site, Masaryk in Ukraine, dates back 15,000 years. Some of these structures required bones from over 150 individual mammoths. Let that number hit you for a second. No hardware store, no timber, no nails, just collective human intelligence, stone tools, and an extraordinary ability to look at a pile of mammoth bones and see a home. And that's exactly what these were. Not emergency shelters, but real homes where people cooked, raised children, made tools, and waited out the brutal Ice Age winter together. And the story of how they kept each other alive goes even deeper than the walls they built. We're obsessed with the lone survivor, the solo hero who disappears into the wilderness with nothing but a knife and comes out the other side stronger. Every survival reality show sells us that same fantasy: one person against the wild, raw instinct versus nature. But here's the truth that ancient humans understood at a bone-deep level. That lone survivor fantasy would have gotten you killed in about 3 days during the Ice Age. The real survival strategy was the exact opposite of going it alone. Core groups ran between 20 and 50 people, but those groups were connected to wider networks of hundreds, sometimes thousands, spread across a much larger territory. This wasn't just social comfort, this was survival infrastructure. Think of it like a distributed system where knowledge, resources, and skills were spread across multiple nodes so that no single point of failure could take everyone down. Lose one camp to a brutal winter. The network holds, the species continues. And within those groups, specialization was everything. Someone knew exactly how to butcher an animal to extract every last calorie from the carcass. Nothing wasted, nothing left behind. Someone else knew where the nutritious roots were hiding under a meter of snow. And then there was the elder, the one who remembered the brutal winter 15 years back, who knew which valley still had deer when everywhere else was empty. That memory wasn't nostalgia. That memory was the difference between eating and starving. That's why the old woman who knew every plant within 100 kilometers wasn't a burden to the group. She was a living library. She was irreplaceable. And those stories told around the fire at night, those weren't entertainment. They were education. They were generations of hard-won survival knowledge encoded into narrative, passed from one mind to the next, keeping the whole community alive in ways that no single hunter ever could. Here's a biological fact that puts everything in perspective. Humans are, at the end of the day, naked apes. We have almost no natural insulation, no thick fur, no dense undercoat, nothing built in to protect us from the cold. Without something covering our bodies, we lose heat faster than we can generate it. And in freezing temperatures, that means hypothermia sets in within hours. Clothing wasn't a fashion choice for Ice Age humans. It was the barrier between being alive and being dead. Now here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Scientists figured out when humans started wearing clothes regularly, not by finding ancient fabric. Fabric doesn't survive 170,000 years, but by studying lice. Body lice live specifically in clothing and textiles, not on skin. And by tracking when body lice diverged evolutionarily from head lice, researchers dated the origin of regular clothing to approximately 170,000 years ago. The parasites that hitched a ride on our clothes became the evidence that those clothes ever existed. But the most jaw-dropping proof comes from a burial site called Sungir in Russia, dating back 34,000 years. 2 children were found buried with thousands of tiny ivory beads sewn directly into their clothing. When researchers reconstructed the garments, what they found was a complete layering system, a fitted inner layer for moisture management, an insulating middle layer to trap body heat, and a tough outer layer of leather to block wind and water. Hood, trousers, boots, a complete cold weather system. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you for a second. That exact 3-layer system, moisture-wicking base, insulating mid-layer, weather-resistant shell, is precisely what modern mountaineering guides recommend today. They figured this out 34,000 years ago through pure trial and error. The generations who got it wrong didn't survive to pass anything on. The ones who got it right did. And somehow, across tens of thousands of years, the answer stayed the same. Let's talk about the math of surviving extreme cold, because it's brutally unforgiving. In freezing temperatures, your body's baseline metabolic rate can spike by 50% or more just to maintain core temperature. That means the caloric demand doesn't creep up gradually, it jumps hard and fast. Fall behind on calories in those conditions, and the consequences aren't just fatigue. You get cognitive slowdown, motor deterioration, and then hypothermia closes in, not over days, sometimes over hours. Eating enough wasn't a matter of comfort, it was a matter of staying functional long enough to stay alive. Which is exactly why fat was the supreme currency of Ice Age nutrition, not protein, not carbohydrates. Fat. It's the most calorie-dense macronutrient that exists, and it's precisely what the body burns to generate heat in the cold. An adult mammoth weighed up to 6 tons and could deliver roughly 500,000 calories, enough to sustain a group of 25 people for weeks. That single animal represented the difference between a group that made it through winter and one that didn't. So hunting one wasn't a casual outing. It was a coordinated operation. Groups drove animals into swampy ground where they got trapped. They set ambushes at river crossings. They used fire and noise to funnel herds into kill zones. This was strategic thinking applied to survival at the highest possible stakes. But killing the mammoth was only half the problem. The other half was storing 500,000 calories with no refrigeration. And here's where Ice Age ingenuity hits differently. They used the permafrost, the permanently frozen ground, as a natural freezer, burying caches of meat directly in the earth. They dried strips of meat over fire. They produced something remarkably close to what we now call pemmican, pulverized meat blended with rendered fat and dried berries. Calorie-dense, nutritionally complete, stable for months. Autumn wasn't a season of rest. It was the most intense work period of the entire year. Every single member of the group focused on one collective goal: build enough stored calories to survive until spring. Miss that window, and spring simply wouldn't come for you. Not everyone waited for winter to pass. Some groups simply left. Seasonal migrations were planned and deliberate, following reindeer, bison, and salmon across vast landscapes with a precision that had nothing to do with wandering and everything to do with strategy. In Upper Paleolithic Europe, groups spent summers at higher elevations and moved down into sheltered river valleys when temperatures dropped. Places where wind was weaker, water stayed partially liquid, and animals converged for the same reasons humans did. The cold wasn't just endured, it was navigated. And here's the detail that makes this undeniable. Stone tool analysis has found specific types of rock transported hundreds of kilometers from their geological source. These weren't accidental movements. These groups carried mental maps of enormous landscapes. They knew the routes, the timelines, what to bring, what to cache along the way. This wasn't instinctive survival behavior. This was strategic planning across time and space, built on accumulated knowledge passed through generations. No other species operates at this level of forward thinking. Which brings us to the cave walls. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, we talk about these paintings as art and spirituality, and they absolutely are, but they may have served a parallel function as visual databases, detailed records of animal behavior, seasonal movement patterns, physical characteristics of prey, information maintained and updated across generations, stored not in writing but in pigment on stone. Art as survival technology, creativity in direct service of staying alive. But perhaps the most underestimated survival tool of all was psychological. Long winters in confined spaces, dwindling food, the awareness that not everyone would see spring, that combination is a blueprint for psychological collapse. And yet evidence of ritual, collective ceremony, and music bone flutes dating back 40,000 years tells us these communities deliberately cultivated cohesion and resilience. A group that holds together survives. These people weren't just enduring their environment, they were actively, collectively, intelligently solving it at a scale we have consistently failed to appreciate. We traded all of it: the communal fire, the intergenerational knowledge, the collective resilience, the living libraries, and the bone flutes, and the mental maps of entire landscapes for central heating, supermarkets, and the ability to order soup from our phones at midnight. That is an extraordinary trade. Genuinely no complaints here. But now that you know what was actually behind all of it, you can never quite look at human history the same way again. These weren't primitive people stumbling through the cold. They were us just running different software on harder hardware, in a world with no margin for error. If this video made you see something differently, drop a comment right now saying 34,000 years ahead. I want to know what hit you hardest. And if you made it this far, you already know this channel is for people who want the real story beneath the story. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss what's coming next. The next video is already on your screen, and if you thought this one was surprising, wait until you see what's waiting for you there.